Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and many apologies. I'm Rosa Vasilaki, and next to me is George Sublis. We are the organizers of the seminar series Politics of Liberation. Thank you very much for joining our seminar. Everyone, as you know, this is Daniel Padilla Peralta, and he's going to talk to us today about a very interesting issue, Classicism and Other Phobias, Antiquity's Emancipation. Daniel is Associate Professor of Classics at Princeton, and he's the author of Undocumented, a Dominican Boy's Odyssey from the Homeless Shelter to the Ivy League, and also the author of the book Divine Institutions, Religions and Community in the Middle Roman Republic. This is a very particular day for us, Daniel, here, as we have the second round of elections on Sunday, and therefore it has been very hard for people to access the center because there is a rally, a political rally before of the elections here in Greece. So apologies for the many delays and complications we have faced. And thank you very much for joining us today.
No, thank you so much for the invitation, and completely understood. My only regret is that I can't join you in person. I really wish I'd been able to join you folks and spend time with you at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in Athens, and to see the fervor of elections firsthand would have been really delightful too. So with gratitude for the introduction, I will simply say a few preliminary words about the project that will form the focus of my remarks today. I'll be discussing a book that I've been working on for the past year or so. And what I should make clear about the book is something I'll say more about in a few minutes, namely that it is a book that is dedicated to examining not just classics understood as a field of study, specifically as a field of study dedicated to the ancient Greek and Roman Mediterranean, but classicism understood as a process, and I'll say more about what I mean by that distinction in a moment. The major objective of the book is to think about the relationship of classics and classicism to Black studies, and more broadly to Afro-diasporic life understood in the longue durée. And to that end, I will summarize some of the case studies in the book and try to make a case for why I believe this kind of book, written at this moment in time, is important for re-examining both the intellectual historical foundations of classics as a discipline and the mechanics and architecture of classicism as a practice, right? But I do have some slides, so I'm gonna attempt to share them right now. And with the slides, I'll work through some of the overarching aims of the book itself, as well as some of its more detailed, granular bits of analysis. So as teased in the abstract, I actually thought it worthwhile to begin with Rosa Luxemburg, and specifically a moment in the Postscript of Theory and Practice. What is of interest to me in Theory and Practice is a very spirited volley directed by Luxemburg against Karl Kautsky on the relevance of a historical example taken from the Roman world to the understanding of mass strike as a possibility, as a viable and actualizable practice in the time at which both Luxemburg and Kautsky were writing. So, as some of you will know, Luxemburg was not terribly enamored of a kind of centrist moderation or spirit of delay. And what had been of concern to her in the use of this historical example that I'll describe in a moment is its valuation of a politics of delay, of a politics of procrastination, as holding some kind of relevance to the revolutionary moment in which Luxemburg was writing and thinking. Kautsky had turned to the figure of the Roman general Quintus Fabius Maximus Cunctator to illustrate the virtues of delay instead of headlong, impetuous rush into action. And for Luxemburg, there was a very easy response to the invocation of this example of historical delay. It was derived from her reading of Theodor Mommsen, and specifically Theodor Mommsen's Roman history, which she quotes in the Postscript. Here's the quotation from Mommsen that is relevant to my aims. Rome, Mommsen wrote in his Roman history, was not saved by the procrastinator, but by the firm union of the federation, and equally perhaps by the national hatred with which the occidental welcomed Phoenician man. So this is Mommsen's attempt to explain why in the end Rome proved successful. Hannibal and the Hannibalic incursion into Italy during the Second Punic War. It's not, according to Mommsen, because Quintus Fabius Maximus Cunctator insisted on avoiding direct conflict with Hannibal on the battlefield, but rather because, as Mommsen writes, there was this firmness to the federation, Rome's alliance system, and a national hatred directed by the Occidental at the Phoenician man that contributed to Rome's success. So, reliant on this citation from Mommsen, Luxemburg goes on to undercut Kautsky's use of Maximus Cunctator as a historical example, and also to raise alarm at the use of this example as a, quote, legend taught to high school students in our schools to drill them in conservative spirits. So that's Luxemburg entering into a debate central to the study of Roman history, central to the study of the Roman Republic, the period of historical inquiry that forms a major focus of my research. And her entrance into this debate is mediated through one of the most distinguished, if not the single most distinguished, modern historians of the ancient Roman world, Theodor Mommsen. But my interest in this has less to do with Luxemburg's flex at Kautsky and more to do with the specific passage that Luxemburg cites. And crucially for my purposes, the racializing and orientalizing tenor of that passage in Mommsen that she cites. So one possible takeaway from this passage is that even radicalism of the most progressive variety can rest on an understanding of the ancient past that reinstates racist and Orientalist constructions of knowledge. And if we are interested in thinking with figures like Luxemburg, and I'll have more to say about other progressive and radical figures in a few minutes, it's important to reflect on what this might mean for the ceiling and upper bounds of the radicalism that is developed by engagement, continuous engagement, not just with the ancient past, but with interpreters of the ancient past. The issue here is qualitatively distinct, or at the very least, it's distinguishable from the point that is developed with such vigor in Karl Marx's The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Marx there noted, as you folks will know, quote, the tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. And just when they seem engaged in revolutionizing themselves and things, in creating something new, precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service, end quote. My interest has to do with the extent to which this summons to the past is predicated on interpretations of that past that necessarily and unavoidably retroject the biases of the past's most influential interpreters. Given that someone like a Theodor Mommsen was overrepresented as an interpreter of the Roman past, and I'll say more about what I mean by overrepresentation in a moment, it's unavoidable that the debate between Luxemburg and Kautsky should hinge, at least in part, on Mommsen's racializing account of the Second Punic War, that national hatred with which the Occidental welcomed Phoenician Man. Often I set up in conversations with my students Mommsen as a central figure in not just the history of the ancient Roman world, but in the reception of antiquity, especially the reception of antiquity in the context of the construction of classics and the early modern nation state. These are some sites, some spaces, disciplinary and paradisciplinary, where we might think about the legacies and challenges posed by particularly historically contingent understandings of the ancient Greek and Roman world for our contemporary uses. For one, we can certainly think about the extent to which someone like a Theodor Mommsen in the 19th century context was animated by, suffused with a concern for the nation state politics of what would become the unified German state. We can also, though, think broader, encompassing the developments of the 18th and 19th centuries within a rubric of study that attends to how the discipline of classics emerges alongside other processes of revolution and innovation, and also occurs and develops alongside forms of regional and super-regional exploitation, colonialism, and post-colonialism, and its many afterlives being central to that. But of interest to me, and at the core of the book, whose contents I will sketch in a few minutes, is the extent to which classics and forms of race-making go hand in hand. These are threads in the history of classics as a discipline that are detectable in other domains as well. We can turn, for instance, to the presence of classics in modern and contemporary literatures, or the presence of classics in the visual and sculptural arts, or the presence of classics in accounts of the history of the humanities, or what Will Bridges has called the inhumanities, and related fields of study, such as the social sciences, which from their genesis in 18th and 19th century contexts have long had entanglements with the field of classics. But I'm interested in what follows in accentuating the relationship of classics to classicism as one specific example and illustration of how the study of the ancient Greek and Roman world enters into dialogue with the construction of alterities and, crucially, of ethnicized and racialized others. And that process is what will bring me to the next part of my talk. So I have on my desk these two newly published books, and they afford a real stimulus to thought. In different but complementary ways, they take up a project that I see as central to the long-term revisioning of ancient studies more generally. So Nios McSweeney's The West, A New History in 14 Lives is an excellent spur for rethinking the idea of the West. You might, again, channel back your memory of Mommsen's Occidental Man, if you'd like, as a constructed entity. And what McSweeney's book is particularly good for thinking about is the provocation delivered by Kwame Anthony Appiah, the philosopher, in the Reith lecture some years ago, and I'll quote that provocation directly: "There is no such thing as Western civilization," end quote. Meanwhile, Christopher Ehret's Ancient Africa, A Global History to 300 CE, addresses itself in part to a profound and enduring writing of Africa out of history that has roots in the Enlightenment and the Sattelzeit, with distinguished culprits such as Kant and Hegel leading the way. One aspect of the book is quite explicitly rectificatory and reparative, and Eric makes this clear in his introduction, from which I'll quote: "The integral intertwining of Africa's past with the overall movements of early world history seems often still not recognized, not because the historical sources and historical information are not there, but because of a lack of engagement by too many historians with the full sweep of that body of information, and also because of sadly persistent and wrong assumptions of the lack of salience of Africa to broader human history before the slave trade. The horrific rationalizations of slavers and slave owners and all the others who benefited from slavery, their appalling, self-justifying myths about Africa as a continent of backward, uncivilized, and most horrifically, inherently inferior peoples live on even today, unexamined in the minds of far too many people around the world," end quote. In the work of combating the misrepresentation of African and Afro-diasporic peoples, I'm going to proceed in a third, but what I hope is complementary direction. I will spend the remainder of our time today introducing what I see as the intellectual historical complement to the historiographical enterprise that's modeled in Eric's book and in McSweeney's book. The objective of this project is to examine the relationship between classicism, understood as a process, and African and Afro-diasporic lives, peoples, and cultures. Because the risks of misapprehension are many and the prospect of misinterpretation all too real, I need now to say a few words about what precisely I mean by classicism. I understand classicism as a system of aesthetic determination and calibration that binds, one, the tradition received and contested within communities across space and time, to two, assertions of chronological precedence and priority, and three, normative presumptions of value. I understand classicism then as primarily a process for turning something into a classical item. And it is from a primarily processualist account of its designs that I derive much of my momentum. The argument that the book project centered on this claim makes is that the discipline of classics, as it comes to life in the racializing, imperializing, and settler-colonialist settings of the early modern and modern Euro-Americas, becomes overrepresented as the dominant and in time the only mode of classicism. My recourse to the language and framework of overrepresentation is an homage to and an application of a core concept in the philosopher Sylvia Wynter's writings, as sharpened in the recent work of Madhura Umachandran. Ancient Greece and Rome were lashed to the hegemonic projections of North Atlantic liberalism as white supremacist and settler colonialist structures of exploitation capitalized on their intensifying ideological and semiotic potency. In contexts as varied, yet interlinked and mutually reinforcing, as the conceptualization of private property and the legalization of human beings as property, the institutional and legal architectures of Euro-American nation states, and indeed of the nation state as a paradigm, the contents and morphologies of global orders of race and racism, sedimenting ultimately into what W.E.B. Du Bois famously characterized as the problem of the color line, and the routinization of human movements and social choreographies around physical and immaterial monuments to the primacy of the West, ranging from the urban sightlines of what Lyra Montero has efficiently distilled as, quote, white columns, white marble, white supremacy. You see a screenshot of that essay on this slide, to the habit-forming enshrinement of ancient Greece and Rome in disciplines and curricula at all levels of education. This overrepresentation goes together with the invisibilizing of value and its interrogation in many of the discipline's practices, such that, as the Post-Classicism's collective has noted in a book that came out in 2020, quote, value is neither mentioned nor interrogated in these scenes of instruction. It is presumed, end quote. And yet, even as the apotheosis of the disciplinary study of ancient Greece and Rome takes off, other forms of classicism remain in circulation, and in some cases even manage to persist despite being pushed to the edge by the overrepresentation of classics. So I see this kind of book as a contribution to a world-building exercise that's far greater than any one scholar or any one community of practitioners. The world-building exercise is the creation of a structure for bringing awareness to other types of classicism and for validating the study of these types of classicism as a reparative corrective to the historical overrepresentation of Greco-Roman classics. The pursuit of this structure remains central to the mission of bracing the classics, the conference series that Sasha May Eccleston and I co-founded several years ago. The development and cultivation of theory in close dialogue with this structure stabilization has guided my research along several axes in recent years, primarily in connection with a historical scrutiny of the process that has been termed by several post-colonial theorists epistemicide, the destruction of knowledges. It is important, I think, for this work that it not take shape primarily around the agenda or initiative of the solitary scholar. And nowadays, I keep a passage from Jackie Alexander's Pedagogies of Crossing, whose cover you see on this slide, taped to the wall right above my desk as a reminder of what matters most. And I'll quote Alexander, "It was with a great deal of help and a deep level of self-scrutiny that I came to understand how a single individual could ignite a political struggle, but ultimately had to be subsumed under it, simply be within it, if that struggle were to be successful. This interior work is indispensable in the journey to wholeness," end quote. I single out this passage and its relevance to the broader vision at work in this lecture and in the book project, because in many settings over the past few years, recent published accounts of the field of classics and of contemporary debates about the future of classics fixate on specific spectacles and specific individuals involved in specific spectacles as entry points into the discipline's practices of racialization and race making. The benefits of theorizing from the situatedness, from the perspectives of those practitioners who are directly involved in these moments are many. But there are some downsides, and I think it needs to be stated quite directly what those downsides are. Public coverage of the discipline's tensions in a host of contexts on both sides of the Atlantic seizes on racialized spectacles of interpersonal conflict and disagreement for the purpose of synecdoche, on the assumption that these moments signify beyond themselves. And I'm holding up on this slide several recent instances of publications that have zeroed in on individual disagreements or individual antagonisms, or have sought to center the individual propounder of change as somehow indexical of debates in the field as a whole. The regularity with which these spectacles are chalked up to an individualized deficit or a personal antagonism marks one obvious limit of their efficacy for constructive work. But spectacles of interpersonal racism proved to be a double-edged sword for another reason. As Jonathan Markovitz has observed in a book entitled Racial Spectacles, whose cover I feature on this slide, attention to racist incidents, quotes, presents a serious quandary for anti-racist activists, end quote, precisely because, and I quote again, the opportunities that they provide for anti-racist organizing and critiques can be undercut once those extraordinary events have faded or been effectively managed, end quote. The struggle for epistemic authority, and with it the possibility of claiming alternatives to historically overrepresented forms of classicism, has, I think, to be conceptualized and realized on a different plane. Having laid this all out, I'll now explain what my project seeks to do in relating Blackness and Black life in relation to classicism, and then go through a set of case studies. The project doesn't take up the history of African American and Afro-diasporic investments in Greco-Roman classics simply as indexical of Black people's ability to do classics. There's no question about that. But the problem is, I think, still deeper. The trouble with dead white men, the late Qadri Ismail once observed in a beautiful essay entitled Exiting Europe, Exciting Postcoloniality, is that some are not men, many not white, and an alarming number not even dead, end quote. To linger for too long on performers and practitioners of classics from historically marginalized or minoritized groups is, as the philosopher Charles Mills observed nearly 2 decades ago, an excellent way of not aggressively engaging the broader debate. Now, the generativity of Black interventions in Greco-Roman classicism is of interest to me, and I will single some of these out, but only insofar as these potentially set the terms for a transformative classicism that is prepared to displace the traditionally overrepresented variety. Ultimately, I seek an answer, however provisional, to the question of whether classicism in general, as a system of value and valuation, is capable of affirming and protecting Black life in the teeth of the predatory violences of the 20th and 21st century ethno-racial Euro-American order, an order whose effects are as keenly felt in the attempts to regulate and, in many instances, actively harm those undergoing circuits of migration from Africa to Europe, as it is felt in the racist violences that occur in the cities and suburbs of North American and European capitals. I take as given and read the provocation of the post-classicism's collective when they write, and I quote, "Why should other cultures not have their own versions of the classical with all the privileges, responsibility, and problems that come with the concept," end quote. But my motivation runs a bit further ahead of this proposition because my interest throughout this work is in identifying whether the forms of classicism that attach to and grow out of African and Afro-diasporic experience have to ultimately be vindicated and supported by a direct assault on the overrepresentation of a classics that has troped itself as Greco-Roman in focus. In thinking about value, I often come back to a passage from Sylvia Wynter's Black Metamorphosis, New Natives in a New World, concerning the foundations of modern racial capitalism, and specifically what Wynter describes as its strive, quote, to extract surplus value from non-white labor. Cultural racism, Wynter explains, is therefore organic, not anomalous, to Western capitalism. In other words, the perception of the Indian, Black, Native as inherently inferior plays a central role in the concrete determination of the value of inferior men and of their inferior labor power. The devaluation of their cultures, which implies the devaluation of their humanity, far from being a merely cultural or superstructural phenomenon, was rooted in a material base, in the economic infrastructure, end quote. The force of Winter's analysis and of the rich and rapidly expanding research into racial capitalism that we see, for instance, in the pages of this recent edited volume, Histories of Racial Capitalism, resides precisely in its focus on the material devaluation of non-white cultures, which proceeds in tandem with and is in fact inseparable from the extraction of surplus value from Black and Native/indigenous communities. If Winter is correct, it stands to reason that the specific forms of classicism that attain monopolistic status in Euro-American modernity are likewise enmeshed within the economic infrastructure of non-white labor exploitation, and that the brand of classicism that holds on to the name of classics is a cog in the machinery of wealth generation and resource hoarding. If Winter is correct, it also follows that not paying attention to this historical fact and the racializing infrastructure that it spawned simply reinstates what John Hamilton has lately described as, quote, an unreflective classicism that, quote, overlooks the historically constructed nature of its values, end quote. Winter's argument is one more reason for classicists to pour themselves into the redistribution of material resources and not simply to indulge in talk of curricular decolonization. But the work doesn't stop there, since Winter's comments on value force to the surface the interconnection of histories of racial and economic oppression with the predication and assignment of aesthetic worth. In terms of this project's general orientation to the humanities, I affirm the belief that's declared with point and verve in Candace True's The Difference Aesthetics Makes, that, quote, the crisis confronting the humanities calls less for their defense and instead prompts the crafting of a vision of what a defensible humanities might be and do and how it differs from its dominant iteration, end quote. And to profess with Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak the necessity of, quote, working towards the impossible task of producing a general will for social justice, end quote. Connected with this crisis and efforts at mitigating it or blunting its rampage is the desperate search afoot in some circles of the humanities for salvation on the backs of the historically minoritized. What the contortions and distortions that are apparent in public debates about the inclusiveness or exclusiveness of Greco-Roman classics and ancient Mediterranean studies and their predominantly white practitioners offer and justify is a psychohistory of the discipline of classics as a site or as a scene for collective neurosis and anxiety. There is much we could say about anxiety and neurosis in defenses of classics. We could, for instance, turn to those who, approaching this as right-wing culture warriors, repeatedly insist that minoritized practitioners seeking to renovate or innovate the field are doing nothing less than to cancel the field or are really the avant-garde of a wokist mob intent on nothing less than the destruction of the humanities. I'm not super interested in those types, although we can talk about them in the Q&A if people are interested. I do think it noteworthy that the paranoias about cancel culture and wokeism have extended and multiplied across national frontiers in the Euro-Americas over the past half-decade, and that they seem ultimately to return to the same kinds of claims, many of which are made without any foundation whatsoever, about what the actual agenda of those seeking to innovate these fields is. I am, though, somewhat interested in folks who would make common cause and even count themselves as allies in the effort to innovate the field, because there is, on occasion, something unstable and unsettling, even about the progressive commitment that is exemplified by some white allies. In the final chapter of a book entitled The Lives of Objects, Material Culture, Experience, and the Real in the History of Early Christianity, Maya Petrosic works through Robin Weigman's object lessons to, quote, ask what subtends and to worry a lot about what happens when we take ourselves and our political gestures too seriously on their own terms and without recourse to the fantasies they entertain. The fantasies themselves might produce an interesting account of the discipline, the undertow of disciplinary attachments, and the negotiations of desires for omnipotence and fears of destruction that they entertain. And these are racially inflected desires and fears for sure. Sarah Mayoga Gallo in 2019 came out with an article entitled The White-Centering Logic of Diversity Ideology that does excellent work in bringing to the surface how, even in attempts to diversify fields, not more often than not, a white-centering logic manages to sneak its way in. This has partly to do with the institutional architecture of universities and of those academic spaces in the Euro-Americas that, in the words of Roderick Ferguson in The Reorder of Things, seek to enshrine the presupposition, quote, that the major institutions of civil society, the academy, the state, and capital, have fostered institutional concepts that protect and shelter minoritized differences and cultures, end quote. The reality, as Ferguson argues, is somewhat different in that, more often than not, these institutional settings are precisely where minoritized differences and cultures are warehoused and managed, often with the avowed intent of blunting their most radical directions and ambitions. After the scholarly association EOS, African Receptions of Ancient Greece and Rome, organized at the 2021 annual meeting for the Society for Classical Studies, a seminar on novelist and literary scholar Toni Morrison's 1988 lecture, Unspeakable Things Unspoken, the Afro-American Presence in American Literature. Several of my classics colleagues at Princeton organized a discussion of our own on this essay, one that was keyed in part to Morrison's contention that, quote, there must be some way to enhance canon readings without enshrining them, end quote. At the time of re-encountering this essay of Toni Morrison's, which is really one of my favorite essays, I kept thinking about a piece penned by Jacobi Areshe Carter entitled Racing the Canon, and an argument that Carter makes in that essay. The American racial canon, Carter writes, is missing what every good canon needs: a lively, active, oppositional set of communities of inquiry. The American race canon historically excluded the very oppositional set of communities that would have had the most theoretically corrective effect on its production, end quote. In thinking through one implication of Carter's argument, I also spent time in the company of my colleague Brooke Holmes' essay, co-authored with Constance Gutenka, on hypercanonicity and hyperinclusivity in a volume whose front cover you see on this slide. And I began to wonder what one could do to elevate an oppositional set of communities of inquiry, with the understanding that Greco-Roman classics and its Euro-American iteration was and continues to be bedeviled by the absences and silences that mark other white-centering epistemic projects that have been successful at shutting out or keeping at arm's length such oppositional communities. This work is underway, but it is underway very slowly. And one of the reasons why it is taking a while to attain critical momentum and liftoff is because of two related tendencies in the professionalizing architecture of classics in its 21st century incarnation. One tendency is the professionalization into the practice of which Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, in a scientific context, has described as white empiricism. The racialization of epistemology that occurs in classics and other adjacent fields, at its core, seeks nothing less than to pull out from underneath those of us who are interested in envisioning new forms of disciplinary belonging, confidence and support in the project of centering our own situated knowledges as central to the field. But a related tendency is apparent in the effort to create within classics a home to the reception of literatures and literary practices that had previously been deemed as marginal to the study of Greco-Roman antiquity. This has often taken the form of projects in the field of classical reception, and lately in the turn of classical reception to the study of texts written by African American, African and Afro-diasporic scholars that had hitherto not received that much attention from classicists. The problem with these practices of reception is that they tend to operate by a logic that both Toni Morrison and the classicist Shelley Haley have drawn attention to. And so on this slide, I provide you with a screenshot of the opening page of an article published by Shelley Haley in 1995 on the affinities between Euripides' Medea and Toni Morrison's Beloved. Here are Haley's words, and I quote them as a meditation on the limits of the kinds of reception work that seek to create bridges between African American and Afro-diasporic literatures on the one hand, and a Greco-Roman classics on the other that is presumed to be somehow separable or distinct from the lived contours of the Afro-diasporic experience. Haley writes, I undertake this comparison of a canonical piece of Western literature, Euripides' Medea, and a masterpiece of the literature of an oppressed people, Morrison's Beloved, with some unease. Morrison's own warning reverberates in my head. This is a warning taken from the Tanner lecture that I featured a moment ago. Finding or imposing Western influences in or on Afro-American literature has value, but when its sole purpose is to place value only where that influence is located, it is pernicious, unquote. As a traditionally trained classicist, Haley continues, it is tempting to do such comparative work and easy to slip into the trap Morrison described. As a Black feminist, it is a political act to resist the pernicious aspects of that work. These issues are not ultimately resolvable, in my view, simply by moving to include other classical traditions within the sphere of classics. That objective, held up by Gigi Yang in a 2022 article on Sinophone classicism, is laudable, but it does tend to incentivize the colonizer fantasies and tendencies of the discipline of classics. I think what is needed is nothing less than a radically destabilizing account of the field and a move away towards the centering of classics and towards the direction of a classicism or a set of classicisms where the material resources for classicizing different aspects of human experience are distributed far more equitably. And to that end, I now offer some brief overview of the case studies in the book before turning to some objections that have been raised to the paradigm under examination here. So my book on classicisms and other phobias begins in the Caribbean. It begins in Haiti, Hispaniola, and it focuses for a moment on an insurgency of formerly enslaved persons led by a person named Lemba, about whom we know very little. I think about insurgency both as a historical fact and as a vehicle for developing a language of relationality to the past history of classics as discipline and to its future as a potentially emancipatory practice. From this exercise in Haiti Hispaniola and its focus on the figure of Lemba, I move next in the book to the study of the production of Dominican identity and Hispanophone Caribbean identities in connection with the Age of Revolutions and its aftermath, and as a bid to recenter the Haitian Revolution as a worthy companion, and in fact, the most necessary companion to the ongoing tendency to fetishize the French Revolution as the catalyst for a modernity. I then move on to thinking with the figure of W.B. Du Bois, and I use this figure so central to the development of Afro-American, Afro-diasporic intellectual history as a limit case for examining the constraining or inhibiting properties of a vision of Black classicism. And one of the devices that I use in analyzing the works of Du Bois and in seeking out their constructive input for the articulation of a new mode of classicism is an analysis through silence. I look for the omission and veiling of Native and Indigenous communities in his works and what that might mean for attempting to establish a commensurability between the experiences of different communities that are on the receiving end of settler-colonialist and racialist violences in the 19th and 20th century. I then move on to examining the work of the artist Kehinde Wiley, and here I approach the work of this Afro-diasporic artist as another limit and test case, looking in particular at how, via the readings and revisionings of classicizing and neoclassicizing sculpture and painting, Wiley develops an iconography for thinking with human-animal hybridity and disposition and attitude as components of a different kind of classicism, one that could potentially redistribute the power to classicize to a much wider range of communities than those historically overrepresented in the form of European man. But even as I raise questions in this project about the prospects of a future, whatever future this might look like, I do try to put some cards on the table for what I think is a desirable future for this new classicism. For the most dynamic visual exemplification of this new classicism, I turn not to Kehinde Wiley, but to a distant ancestor of Kehinde Wiley's artistic practice. This is the painter Andrés Sánchez Galque in his 1599 painting, Los Mulatos de Esmeraldas. While the circumstances of this painter's life remain rather obscure, the painting commemorates a singular and transformative moment in the interactions of the Spanish Empire with indigenous and Afro-indigenous coalitions in South America. Here in this painting, we see realized, if only fleetingly, coalition of the kind that vaults past the incommensurabilities that I track with reference to Du Bois, and that answers the demand for material redistribution that's central to my own objectives in seeking out reparation. The gold here is the key. This painting was curated some years ago at the Museo de América in Madrid. And in a response to the exhibition that grew around this painting, the Iberianist Baltasar Fra Molinero advanced an Afrofuturist appraisal of this painting, crediting as its main inspiration the movie Black Panther. Here is what Fra Molinero said, and I'll explain why it matters so much to my interest in envisioning new modes of classicism in a moment. For Fra Molinero, what we can glean from an Afrofuturist stance depends in no small part on, and I'll quote him in translation, placing oneself in the eyes of the three mulatto gentlemen and the indigenous artist himself, who proposes an official framing in which those portrayed are represented with authority. This authority is a formulation of a possible future. Some descendants of Blacks and Indians are seen sharing power, or at the very least, a portion of that power. Because to be the subject of portraiture and named with an honorific title in the frame of the canvas itself is synonymous with holding authority. These three authorized figures who are being sent from the Indies to the King of Spain represent a moment of crisis in the structure of Spanish power, a future that questions the racial hegemony arrived from the Iberian Peninsula. The Mulattos of Esmeraldas amounts to a pictorial construction, a fiction that shares objectives with the speculative Afrofuturist fictions of the present moment, the novels of Octavia Butler or Samuel Delany, which are epistemological projects that declare, from an Afro-diasporic historical perspective, that Black people will exist in the future and not merely as heralds of chaos, that Black people are the future. This seems to me a more substantial provocation, indeed a real improvement on the artist Alicia Wormsley's "There Are Black People in the Future" billboards, one of which you see photographed here. Whereas Wormsley's project carves out a place for Black people on the far horizon of the future, Fra Molinero's reading of the painting places its hopes in a futurity that is not just sort of fully synonymous, but that is in fact coextensive with Blackness. But I remain doubtful that such a future, if it is to be livable for Afro-diasporic peoples, is compatible with the maintenance of a classicism whose overrepresentation has systematically shoved Blackness and Black people to its margins. Here I am thinking with a passage in an edited volume to which I contributed some years ago. This is in the introduction to Classicisms in the Black Atlantic, edited by Ian Moyer, Adam Lechner, and Heidi Morse. In this volume, the editors sought to emphasize a plurality of classicisms, I think with good reason. They go on to explain this emphasis, quote, represents an acknowledgement that the reconstruction of classicisms entailed in recuperating and representing experiences in the Black Atlantic will be capacious and involve the past of Egypt, Ethiopia, West Africa, the Middle East, and other parts of the ancient world. End quote. But, and here is my hesitation, the recreation of this plurality cannot, indeed should not, offer the historically or represented variety of classicism another lease on life. In other words, hegemonic modes of white-centering classicism have got to go. Otherwise, they will continue to menace the cultivation and elevation of other classicisms, not least by hogging the material and cognitive resources through which these can be most efficiently and enduringly reproduced. In other words, and here is something we would be well served to think about in the Q&A, we have to think about trade-offs. What does it mean to invest materially in the representation of classicisms that have been historically underrepresented. But the big problem as I see it in this work, and the reason why it will be very difficult for allies to build up numbers within the field of classics itself, is that there are some classicists who are so scared of Afro-diasporic presence and of Black thought that they can't even really think straight about some of the issues of urgency here. I'll work through an example. In 2021, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung rose to prominence as a leading channel of Anglophone debates over classics for German reading audiences. One of the essays from this year that was much discussed is, I think, revealing for how it models ostensibly dispassionate comment on the crisis of classics from the perspective of those practitioners in classics who are most zealous about sustaining its white centering overrepresentation. The essay is written by Heidelberg's Jonas Grethlein, and it begins with some remarks on affirmative action in the United States that mainly serve to confirm an adeptness for ingesting conservative talking points. So Grethlein holds that in a North American context, and a specifically US context, scientific study, quote, is seen less as the production of knowledge than as an expression of identities through which oppressed minorities can emancipate themselves, end quote. Wissenschaft wird weniger als die Produktion von Erkenntnissen, denn als Ausdruck von Identitäten gesehen, durch den sich unterdrückte Minderheiten emanzipieren können. Grethlein's essay and the small book into which it subsequently metastasized, a screenshot of the cover is on this slide, is striking for its complete disregard of decades of work at the intersection of social identities and epistemology, as well as its blithe peddling of the tired and false distinction between commitments to social emancipation and the generation of academic knowledge. It's all fine and well to raise concerns about the range and merits of situated knowledges and standpoint epistemology. These concerns are the focus of spirited debates in political theory, in feminist philosophy, in Black studies, in gender studies, queer of color critique, indigenous studies, Asian American studies, Latinx studies, eco-criticism, the list goes on and on. And one can always demand a fuller philosophical accounting for the parameters and affordances of this work, along the lines that are pursued in the writings of philosophers like Linda Martin Alcoff, and more recently Jose Medina and Brianna Toole. But what one is not at liberty to do, especially when insisting on the need for greater rigor, is simply ignore this work, or simply offer potted summaries that fail to represent either the work or the substantive criticisms that are lodged against it. Let me give you an illustration of how this works in Grethlein's article. Having boiled down my position to the proposition that, quote, as an immigrant, as a Black immigrant, I could view oppression and other phenomena in antiquity differently and better than my white colleagues, end quote, Grethlein writes, here the identity of the researcher becomes the reason for new knowledge. The logic of identity is connected with the logic of knowledge. Die Identitätslogik ist mit der Erkenntnislogik verbunden. One is excited for the books and essays that will redeem Peralta's claim, and in the meantime will appreciate other works even more, such as the much praised analysis of the enslaved in Roman comedy that Amy Richland was able to produce without any experience of enslavement herself, end quote. So there are two issues here. The first issue is the conspicuous inability to credit even the possibility of any substantive relationship between racial situatedness and knowledge production. Grethlein's own failure to appreciate that his own racialized subjectivity might organize his lines of sight is notable yet unsurprising. There are consequences to this that extend far beyond Grethlein. For instance, there is an ongoing difficulty within the study of race and ethnicity in ancient history to take into consideration the benefits of moving away from forms of interpretive and historiographical practice that do not simply recenter whiteness or renorm whiteness. And for this reason alone, Shelley Haley's provocation in 2009 to embrace critical race theory because it, quote, challenges the experiences of whites as the norm, while at the same time it centers its conceptual framework in the experiences of people of color, end quote, it's worthwhile. Related to this is the inability to see that professionalization into whiteness has consequences for the shapes of different disciplines, from the demographics of their practitioners to the kinds of things that get published. And these are topics that are regularly taken up in other disciplinary contexts. So, for instance, in the field of the history of science and medicine, there's been much discussion of this. More recently, in the field of Slavic studies, there's been an effort to think quantitatively about the imprint of race in publications within that field. But the biggest issue, as I see it, is that Grethline's treatment of the relationship between the logic of identity and the production of knowledge actively mischaracterizes the work of the scholar who is singled out as exemplifying for him how to carry out historical investigation without centering one's own identity or situated knowledges in the process. So the cultural historian, Amy Richland, who teaches at UCLA, cited by Grethline as illustrative of the principle that generating research into the experiential universe of an oppressed position is separable from one's own identity, is a historian who regularly works with scholarship that is grounded in the relationship between identity, oppression, and knowledge production. I unfortunately don't have the time to go through Amy Richland's work with you and sort of bask in its glow, but here are some highlights of that engagement. The contextualizing overviews of the essays that were published in the volume Arguments with Silence, as well as the introductory matter and framing material of an important paper on enslaved women in Plautus that came out in 2015, are excellent for bringing out how regularly Richland engages with feminist scholarship, and in the case of the 2015 essay, Black feminist scholarship, in developing structures for analyzing the historical and literary record of Roman slavery. Even though Richland herself doesn't occupy the oppressed positions at the center of her work, all of these writings center her commitment to a feminism that foregrounds consciousness of gender-based oppression, and in that respect it can correctly be affirmed, contrary to Grethline's insinuation, that social positionality and positionalities inflect her epistemic orientation and indeed her scholarly productivity. If we can say that about gender and about its impact in shaping and refining the points of analytical vantage in Richland's work, and if we can take another step to acknowledge the significance of gender in providing a structure for historical analysis, a point developed over the course of the 1980s and 1990s, and now taken as the given in modern historical fields, as well as in ancient history, why could we not say the same about race? Why could we not say the same about the impact of racial situatedness and racial subjectivity on the capacity to construct, develop, and further scholarly perspectives? That, to me, is the question in need of answering, and the question for which the kinds of analysis reflected in Grethline's writing don't really give us any purchase. That gatekeepers and classics are only now and reluctantly coming to terms with this question is all the more justification not only for cultivating responsible partnerships with disciplines that have been asking and parsing that question for decades, but also for properly valuing the embodied and situated knowledges of practitioners from historically minoritized groups. Otherwise, the search for answers to this question will simply decompose into raids on other disciplines and minoritized practitioners in these other disciplines for theory. In any case, Grethline's essay, despite or because of its short-sightedness, is a serviceable introduction to some of the criticisms that are routinely raised, either openly or behind closed doors, to the project of centering and theorizing race and racism in the historical and contemporary constitution of classics as discipline and of classicism as a process. Common to many of these criticisms is an indifference to the material conditions that fuel and sustain the overrepresentation of classics as a gleaming exemplar of classicism. This indifference precludes any rigorous attempt to sketch, still less to execute with care, a historical sociology of the discipline that is honest about the imprinting of racism and settler-colonialism on its structures of thought. Often what we get instead are forms of pretend class analysis that are mounted against those who are actively involved in the work of disciplinary critique, and that either slyly or not so slyly seize on the relative economic privilege and institutional security of some of these critics as a pretext for dismissing their criticisms, or seek to fault these critics for appearing to play by the rules of the academic game. But this analysis fails for a simple reason. It doesn't engage with what the scholar Fred Moten, improvising on Fred Hampton, has called the problematic of coalition. In Fred Moten's words, the coalition emerges out of your recognition that it's fucked up for you in the same way that we've already recognized that it's fucked up for us, end quote. And it fails because it's not authentically vested in growing solidarity, the kinds of solidarity that, as Sita Shaganti and others have explained, strives for racial justice and liberation beyond the constraining imperative to survive of any one field or any one minoritized group. To conclude, traveling the space of Greco-Roman antiquity's overrepresentation as the classical demands nothing less than direct confrontation with what Sally Humphreys has described as, quote, the particular conjuncture of the disciplinary process with the development of the modern university and with intensified colonialism. It is these processes, according to Sally Humphreys, that, quote, positioned Greco-Roman studies as a model both for the disciplinarization of other fields in the humanities and for the identification of the study of classical texts and other civilizations, end quote. But it's not only a matter of exemplary positioning. Many years ago, I stood in the halls of the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Brussels, Belgium, staring intently at Jacques-Louis David's Mars des Almeides. Not long after my trip to see this painting, it would appear on the cover of a programmatic venture in monumentalizing the study of the classical tradition, co-edited by Tony Grafton, Glenn Most, and Salvatore Settis. From the halls of the Royal Museum to the halls of the Royal Museum for Central Africa, in the wooded suburb of Tervuren, it's only a 50-minute ride on public transport. But there you get to stare not only at King Leopold's ghosts, but at the inner circuits of the world systemic and world-rending violences through which the wealth to imagine lushly and propagate vociferously Greco-Roman classicism moved. Mary Beard and John Henderson wrote in 2000, "We are all already classicists, however much or little we think we know about the Greeks and Romans," end quote. But high-minded affirmations of liberal inclusion turn sour when the costs begin to be tallied up. There's good reason to resist being interpolated into that generalizing, we are already classicists. If Cheikh Anta Diop could chart a path towards an anthropologie sans complaisance, there's surely an opening for a non-compliant classicism. That non-compliant classicism would take its inspiration from the urgency of engaging Vanessa Stovall's summons in a 2021 Twitter thread to a classicism disordered through blackness. Stovall here was nodding to the marvelous work by R.A. Judy, Sentient Flesh. But if you all just simply pause to reflect for a moment on the extent to which the overrepresentation of ancient Greece and Rome as the one and only classicism quite literally entailed the looting of entire worlds, it will be difficult, I think, for you to keep much faith with the enterprise of classics or of classicism. The opening of Latin America's veins, Eduardo Galeano's phrase, Europe's underdevelopment of Africa and Asia, to hearken to Walter Rodney, capitalism and slavery, to channel Eric Williams. These racial and colonial processes, underwriting as they do the modern global order, cannot be divorced from the capabilities for overrepresentation that accrued increasingly to classics at the cost of other classicisms. Yet these ravages also dictated on a more fundamental level the very properties of classicism, as well as the likely inextricability of these properties from racial empires' designs. Sebastian Matzner has recently suggested that the work of, quote, declassicizing the classics requires probing deeper into the cultural politics and intercultural dynamics of classicism itself, end quote. Examination of the racist settler-colonial intimacies of classicism is where that work properly begins, but it ends with a treatment of and a reparative move against the material accumulation of resources or the overrepresentation of Greco-Roman classics to the exclusion of an actually equitable distribution of resources for other forms of classicism. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was so rich and very interesting. We were looking forward to your talk here, to listen to you from here, from Greece, from Athens. Oh, you can't hear me.
I can't hear you.
Okay. 1 second. Oh, no. 1 second. Δεν μας ακούει. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Είμαστε muted, Boris.
All right.
Okay.
Now I can hear.
Can you hear us now?
Yes, now I can hear.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We were looking forward to your talk here from Athens, one of the, perhaps not the centers of classicism, but certainly the center of that kind of imaginary. And thank you for very much, because that was rich and interesting and provocative. So before I start with my own questions, I would like to ask the audience first if you have any questions or thoughts to share with us. Should I start first? What do you think? So I'll take advantage of of my role today. And I was very interested by myself, I'm a historian and a social theorist, and I was very interested, epistemologically speaking, your project is fascinating, but I was wondering whether we need to push that kind of, I don't know whether to call it deconstruction or situatedness further, in the sense, can we really use the master's tools to dismantle the house of the master? Do we really, should we look at classics as a discipline that needs to be not just rethought, but perhaps entirely reimagined and perhaps relabeled, repackaged, and with an opening to the whole world? How we can to kind of like dismantle classicism from classics while keeping this as a distinct discipline? Do we really need such disciplines that are so central, as you have demonstrated, and as we know from other disciplines, in creating those kinds of hierarchies and creating those kinds of binaries that actually underlie our current world, between whiteness and blackness, between upper classes and lower classes, between the West and the rest, and so on and so forth. And the discipline has been central to that. So shouldn't we be looking at actually rethinking whether we need to dismantle the discipline entirely and think about antiquity in different words?
All right. So, yeah, well, the reason I jumped in just now is that the sound had cut out for a moment. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So this is a great question, and I admit to not having the best formed answer for this, but I'm going to try to give two answers. So I think one issue to sort out straight away, and something that I found sort of remarkable in some of the coverage of debates in classics in France and in Italy, but also in Greece too, is that there was this concern that calling for a radical revisioning of classics would mean the elimination or the cancellation of the content of classics, right? And here I'll simply say, although we can talk more about this in a follow-up, that to some degree the future of the content of the classics is cleavable or separable from the field of classics itself. Like, people are still going to read Homer. That's not exactly what I'm interested in. What I am interested in, though, is first of all a historical account of the genesis of the disciplines that is more faithful to the extent of their implicatedness and rootedness within circuits of settler-colonialism and racism. And then second, the future vision of those disciplines that takes up the imperative of answering to that past from a vantage point of fully accepting responsibility, and says, all right, given that this has been true for the field, what can we do to envision new forms of relation with ancient communities and with pre-modern cultures that does not simply reinstate some of the practices that we have seen develop directly as the consequence of the field's historical and contemporary evolution with forms of structural violence. So here is why I state very matter-of-factly that it would be fine with me to see the discipline of classics in its current form disappear, right? So what I mean by disappearance is not that, again, people would stop reading Homer or teaching ancient Greek. Rather, that the current disciplinary configuration that we understand as classics would cease to exist. And I think it's important to embrace this vision for a couple of reasons. One reason was laid out very well by Hans Gumbrecht in the 2003 volume, The Powers of Philology. And in one of the chapters, Gumbrecht addresses himself to the sort of anxieties that many students, many practitioners of pre-modern studies, and specifically ancient studies, have about the viability and survivability of their fields. And so he writes, if we want to return to an attitude of confidence, if we want, so to speak, to re-energize our self-image, then it will be important not to exclude the worst-case scenario from our reflections and debates. In other words, Gumbrecht continues, we should not exclude the possibility that the humanities might indeed have reached their historical ending. After all, they had their clearly marked beginning as institutions in the early 19th century, and their beginning as an explicit program around 1900. Moreover, numerous societies and cultures exist quite happily without academic discipline such as ours, and so on. So the one issue I would have with Gumbrecht's formulation in this passage is the worst case scenario bit. I don't think it would be a worst case scenario if classics and other humanities fields cease to exist in their current form. I think that there are opportunities here for real growth. But, and now we have to get to another problem, I refuse to make common cause with people and with entities, including national governments, who would take what I'm saying or what other similarly minded folks are saying as an excuse to starve the humanities into non-existence, right? So like the issue here is that in formulating a vision of a future for humanistic study that encompasses, as Gumbrecht insists we think about, a end to the humanities in their current form and their potential reinvention as something else, I am necessarily courting a measure of risk because there are many, many sectors of Euro-American society, and in fact, throughout the world in its current vice grip of capitalism, that would say, if it is not immediately instrumentalizable for the purposes of profit, then we must do away with it. And so the humanities would be taken to be as one of these particular intellectual practices that is not cleanly linkable to the generation of profit. And at that point, folks would say, let's be rid of it, right? So I'm not saying that we get rid of the humanities in order to kowtow to those capitalist imperatives that would insist on the need to have only the most instrumentalizable forms of knowledge, only those forms of knowledge that feed most directly into the machinery of creating permanent workers as central to the operations of the state. I would not want that at all, right? If anything, I would see a future beyond the humanities as a future where we can think more critically about how to create forms of knowledge production that empower people to resist against capital. But given that the historical evolution of the humanities is in fact deeply bound up with capital, this would be one more reason for calling to all of us to the work of envisioning a future post-classics, post-humanities, in whatever configuration we may choose. There is, though, and this will be my sort of final comment on this, another limitation here. It's a limitation that has to do with the relative poverty of our language for imagining this future. So Mark Fisher, in the lectures that were published posthumously under the heading Post-Capitalist Desire, had in one of his lectures a discussion with his students about the meaning of the term post-capitalism. And he held out to his students the premise that post-capitalism could mark not just simply like a sort of supersession of capitalism, but a victory over capitalism, right? And he held that out to them in the hope of challenging them to think about what a triumph over an existing form of regulating human activity might look like. And as an invitation, as a goad to reflect on what strategies for the realization of that triumph might look like. But as he himself then went on to admit, part of the problem with the language of post-capitalism is that it reinstates capitalism by making it so that we can't displace capitalism from the center of our imaginations. So take that line of argument and apply it to classics and classicism. One of the most bracing ideas behind the work of the Post-Classicism Collective, whose book I sampled from a number of times in the presentation, was the idea that we could move to a form of disciplinary practice that is post-classicism. I like this idea. I think it's great. And I think that if we wanted to buy Fisher's line about what the post in post-capitalism might signify, we could well say, apropos of the Post-Classicism Collective, that their vision for post-classicism is ultimately committed to a victory over classicism in its present form. But again, as I noted a moment ago with reference to Fisher's own concern about post-capitalism, it's not at all clear that such a victory will be as total as we need it to be. If we're thinking about post-classicism, we're still well tied to classicism, because we can only imagine our way through a post-classicism by reflecting on the limitations of classicism. This is a necessary hermeneutic challenge to confront, but I don't have a straight answer to like what it might mean to move from the moment of that hermeneutic encounter to a future that is, I think, genuinely an emancipatory one in which we're no longer bound by the historical parameters of what has come to be constituted as a historically overrepresented form of classicism. So that's my answer to that question.
Thank you very much. Can you hear us? Thank you. Thank you very much. What's going on with the microphone? Are there any other questions, please? Jorgen, George, would you like to ask your questions now?
More questions.
So, okay. So, hello, I'm George. So my question is the following
I can't hear you. Maybe you should use the microphone, George.
Go for this one.
Now? No.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Sounds great.
Now. So my question is a short one. Uh, in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned Rosa Luxemburg and Kautsky. So in my, writings, one of the topics that I examine is one of the Greek Marxists of the 20th century, of the first decade, that have studied in Germany. And his main point of reference was the theorist of German social democracy, Plekhanov and Bauer, etc., etc. So, and this theorist, and I think this is something to expand, it becomes clear that he has a very, I mean, Orientalist view of non-Western countries, and I was wondering to which extent do you think that, social theory, even the socialist version of it, is bound with, Eurocentrism, and how we can imagine this decoupling of these two things. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's very helpful to think with.
Yeah.
And thanks so much for the question. So your question raises what I think is a sort of obvious concern, which is that if we can look past Kautsky, we can look at a host of other folks drawing from the same well of radical thinking that propels the first 2 or 3 generations of Marxists forward. And the concern with virtually all of them, I mean, there may be like 1 or 2 exceptions, but they're not really exceptions. The concern with almost all of them is that their accounts of historical materialism tend to be either expressly or implicitly Orientalizing. They have very little concern for interest in the place of indigenous and First Nations communities, except as these exist in some primitivizable past, right? And here now we get to like what is a sort of another major limitation. They do not develop an architecture for analysis that places race or racial formation on the same level of historical causality as class. Now, that is not an insurmountable problem as far as I'm concerned. And in recent decades, there has been a great deal of energy in Marxist thought devoted to how to sort of repair these various oversights. The one area where, as folks will know, there is, I think, still some very heated disagreement concerns the precise relationship of race to class in any materialist account. So what is this relationship exactly? So one line would hold that race is, for all intents and purposes, an epiphenomenon. It exists secondarily. It is constituted either as a prismatic effect of an ideological effort in striving to mystification, and or it exists or it emerges at a crucial point in the struggle over and the sequelae over the struggle over the means of production, whereby those who are progressively alienated from the means of production are sort of fed this story about the construction of racial difference. So this is one avenue. Another avenue, though, would hold that in a profound sense, even while enmeshed with each other and interarticulated with each other, race and class are to some degree incommensurables, and that we might actually have to move in the direction of developing a historical materialism that predicates not class but race as its center, and then try to sort of test the two, see like which of the two holds greater explanatory power. I mean, I have to, again, sort of put my cards on the table. I think that any sort of materialist account that is not attentive to the distinctiveness of race is doomed analytically. At the same time, I think it's important also to hold that class is not some epiphenomenon of race, and that we do need to treat the two as having distinct but interrelated functions in the construction of capitalist modernity. What that means, though, for the sort of short-term effort of reconceptualizing and re-signifying the work of really, Marx, Engels, and then their successor interpreters is trickier. So in one chapter of the book, I draw attention to Engels' interest in the writings of Lewis Morgan and in the writings that from the 1850s and 60s on attempt to give an account of indigenous and native communities more generally. And so what I say in treating this material is simply that for Engels and for others, there simply isn't a way of bringing indigenous and native communities into the historical present, a present that is simultaneously describable as defined by reference to the grids of race and class. These only exist, and I'm thinking here specifically of Engels' engagement with Morgan on the question of native communities. These communities only existed as objects of dispossession. They were dispossessed totally, and that's it. I mean, having been victims of dispossession, they are no longer active agents in any historical process, and for that matter, I mean, many of them are dead. I think that, this representation, while deliberately oversimplifying, is true to a dilemma that surfaces in writings of this period when they do touch on communities that for various reasons are seen as somehow no longer participatory in the forward momentum of historical progress. But this is where I think it's important to emphasize that such an estrangement from the motor of history is indexical, I think, of a shortcoming in these writings, which is the failure to recognize how race is constituting communities in ways that are rather different from how, say, class relations are constituting them. But that I think is where I would see the sort of gravamen or the substantive force of your question finding an appropriate home. I would ultimately sort of see much of the work of interest in this tradition as being generative for the purposes of thinking about what a future beyond the domains and configurations of racial capitalism looks like. But note that by attaching racial to racial capitalism and invoking in that sense the writings of Eric Williams and also Cedric Robinson, I am pointing to a later stage in the development of Marxism, one that in the writings of Robinson and others did attempt to take rather seriously the proposition that race and class are engaged in an interlocked and repeatedly reproduced sequence of historical interactions, but that one cannot be collapsed into the other, as has been the tendency to do in some circuits of Marxist thinking. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Have you got any questions, or should I ask my following question? Yes, did you raise your hand at the back? Did you raise your hand? Yes? Oh, okay. Well, I have another question which pertains to the resistance you have found to your project. For instance, we know about resistance that originates in politics, we have our own versions of the far right and the alt-right and the appropriation of antiquity. Here in Greece, it has become more intense in the past 15 years, more systematic. We've got formations, actually, of the far right in the upcoming elections on Sunday, claim to be Spartans and using that label for their political party. So we are aware of the political resistance related to your project. What kind of epistemological and academic resistance you have encountered so far? I mean, you mentioned a few things, but if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that question, too, because it, I think, speaks directly to an issue that, you know, I touch on in the talk itself, but that definitely requires some more fleshing out. So what's been so striking to me about responses within the field of classics by, you know, professional classicists to far-right appropriations, especially far-right appropriations in the political realm, has been the conviction that, first, we can and should study these appropriations, which is good, right? I mean, one should study them. And two, that, second, that documenting them or inventorying them and then calling out how these far-right appropriations misconstrue or misinterpret or distort the classical past in some way is, on the whole, a valuable and corrective exercise, right? So one says, for instance, of far-right groups that are fixated on the image of Sparta, oh, look at how they represent Sparta. Look at these ideas they have about Sparta. Look at how fantastically undersourced or historically incorrect these ideas about Sparta are, so on, right? Or one looks at the iconography. One looks at the choices these groups make in zeroing in on aspects of, say, ancient Greek hoplite iconography, or seizing tags drawn from ancient Greek literature, such as molon labe, right? And says, oh, look at these. We can document them, we can inventory them, but in many cases, the people who are participating in these projects know little about the actual substantive historical record of Sparta, or of its cultural practices, or of Sparta's representation among other ancient communities and so on, right? So in saying all of this, I am channeling a form of engagement with this material. But what I will now say is that while that form of engagement is important, it also introduces the prospect of divorcing the study of these appropriations from a politically activist stance against these appropriations. And it sets to the side a still bigger question, the question at the core of my project, of whether these appropriations tell us something important about the present and future of classics and classicism. Do classics and classicism have a kind of inbuilt affinity for fascist or neo-fascist appropriations? I don't think so, maybe, but I have to say on some days I feel that maybe my original suppositions about this were not actually the right ones. And the reason why I am growing increasingly skeptical of the older line I used to take, which is that, you know, there is no such inbuilt affinity. Surely classics can be put to work in emancipatory context too. The reason I'm growing suspicious of this is that when we look, for instance, at the study of appropriations in the field of classics, it's amazing how compartmentalized this form of study is, how easy it is for classicists to take this and to move this into a box within the field. And then say, it's there, it's in the box, that's it. We study it in this one particular setting. We, under classical reception studies, look at these appropriations and we study them, but that's it. Right? this gets us to the issue of epistemological resistance that you raise in your question. Because actually what I see as interesting and as worth studying further is the pervasiveness of attitudes about the historical and present functions of classics across all of the different subfields of the discipline, right? So normally, and this has been particularly the case in North Atlantic settings, although we could multiply settings beyond the North Atlantic for this. The tendency is to say that these far-right appropriations do not represent what the field of classics is all about. Or to say, well, they're doing their thing, but classics is actually about so much more, right? But what if it is the case that the discipline of classics and forms of racial and settler-colonialist violence have such a deep history alongside each other that it is actually substantively inconceivable to imagine a form of the discipline of classics that is not reproducing some kinds of racial and settler-colonialist epistemic violence? What if, right? So in order to think about that question, there are a couple of sort of methodological preliminaries. And I noted one of these in passing early on in the talk, but I can now say a little bit more about it. Classicists have tended to approach the study of knowledge transmission chiefly by reference to the transmission of texts, and to say that one of the sort of standout features of the development of the discipline of classics in early modernity down to the contemporary moment is a rigorous and exacting attention to the study of how texts are transmitted across time, right? Of course, these are only certain kinds of texts, right? Some kinds of texts get privileged in this and others do not. I am concerned with a bigger process of knowledge transmission and destruction. In this 2020 article on epistemicide, I had been thinking with several post-colonial theorists who had focused on different forms of knowledge that, attaching as they do to very historically contingent relationships between communities and their lands, tend to get effaced and are actively, in some cases, the focus of efforts at destruction on the part of imperializing or full-blown imperial systems. And as part of that work, I had tried to reflect on the possibility that the discipline of classics itself is implicated in forms of epistemicide. And to that end, I had begun to think about what it meant to see classics as a unique beneficiary of the kinds of overrepresentation that I study in connection with this current book project. And for this, I have to give some quite concrete examples, drawn liberally. So one set of examples can be taken right from the history of modern Greece and the history of modern and contemporary Athens. What does it take to dial the clock back some 2,500 years and center the Acropolis and the Parthenon as central to the construction of Greek identity? Well, it involves a lot of things. Well, one of the things that it most involves is the complete occlusion of Ottoman identity. And hand in hand with that, a strident and at times vociferous denunciation of Turkish identity and Turkish history as bound up with the construction of the Aegean and of Greek identity. So this is one angle we could take, right? We could say, all right, let's look at how in a particular setting that is understood to be a nodal point for the construction of the classical, a certain set of affective and identitarian positions has to be mobilized, and one consequence of that mobilization unfolding over the course of the history of independent Greece is the occlusion of an active effacing of another history that has at its core a different set of racializing and ethnicizing attachment. Right? But we can move beyond that. We can also think about the extent to which other European countries participate in the process of simultaneously, over the course of the 1700s and 1800s, extracting and looting from portions of the Mediterranean, including Greece, in order to build up their own commitments to a classicizing heritage, while at the same time denying access to the wealth and resources for reproducing and enshrining that heritage within these countries, right? So a contingent iteration of this debate, as some of you will have suspected from the wording that my sentences just took a moment ago, is the debate about the Parthenon marbles. What makes it possible for Britain to hold on to these things and to resist repeated efforts to reclaim them? This is a material, economic, and also imperial process that defines the construction of classics and classicism in the 19th and 20th centuries as one for which countries such as Great Britain are presumed and in fact enabled as leaders and caretakers and warehousers, while countries from which these artifacts actually derive are relegated to the secondary rank of being simply objects of study rather than agentive subjects of the study of their own cultural patrimonies, right? But again, this extends still further. It extends across the Atlantic and beyond, encompassing different communities that, for various reasons, all ultimately linked to the interlaced operations of racialization and capital, are each at various points in the trajectory from early modernity to the contemporary moment denied access to the cultural resources that form part of their identities, and at the same time are subjected to a form of what the philosopher Miranda Fricker has termed epistemic injustice, right? So at the point that your communities are being looted of the resources that constitute aspects of their matrimony or patrimony, and also being denied the materials necessary to understand and fully appreciate the contours of that process, we are facing a form of epistemic injustice that has profound implications. Right? At that point, then, it becomes important to devise a history within the discipline of classics that is sensitive to these procedures and concerns, and yet, this now brings me to the epistemological resistance issue. Many of the classicists I've encountered are not terribly well versed in the histories of empire and domination that constitute the foundation of their own knowledge practices. So, in a sense, one of the issues that is most readily on display is what the late philosopher Charles Mills referred to in a series of publications as white ignorance. And white, he affixed to that in part to insist on the centrality of race and racialization to this form of ignorance. But what he goes on to show in his papers on this subject is that when we talk about white ignorance, we're talking about a form of race making that enshrines whiteness as the capacity to hold on to dominate, to be in ownership of a set of prized goods, which can range from actual substantive material wealth to the more harder to quantify, but for that reason, all the more precious forms of artistic and aesthetic wealth that are steadily accumulated under the auspices of whiteness, a whiteness that does not allow itself any measure of sustained interrogation or self-interrogation, and that actually runs away from doing it, right? These are the kinds of resistances that characterize contemporary discussions in the field of classics and related fields. And we see them often in conversations about, for instance, issues of cultural patrimony, but we also see them in connection with efforts at rethinking the historical and colonial lineages of the field itself. But that's to be expected. Once any field is confronted with challenges to the fundamental order of things within that field, it becomes a matter of saving face, and in some cases just pure amour propre for individuals in that field to say that actually the field is not like that at all. It's not actively complicit in these forms of colonial violence. But that's the challenge, that's the hurdle to overcome now.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this answer. We have one final question. George has one question, and go on.
So, my question is the following one. What you describe, especially about, the Greek case, it has to do, to a big extent, with the formation of the Greek state. What I mean with this is that, these processes of cultural transmission and the way that antiquity and has been represented in fields of like this of archaeology. It's a process that goes back to the 9th century and the formation of the state as such. So, given that this type of representation, it is a structural feature of the national image of Greece itself. How we can, think, because it's not just Greece, there are other states, in that way. How we can imagine, this type of process of liberation of the sciences within nation states? That, do you see what I mean? To a certain extent, would mean, the dismantling of the states as they have been formed through modernity
You said it. You said it. This would require dismantling the state, right? So I guess, to go back to that passage from Mommsen that Luxemburg cites, I held it up as illustrative of like a certain sort of hard-baked Orientalizing and racializing strand in Mommsen's thinking and in the architecture of study of the ancient world during that period more generally. But what I also, alluded to, if only briefly, was the extent of Mommsen's own nationalist nation-state building objectives, as reflected not only in these moments in his work on Roman history, but in other settings as well. And if one takes seriously the evidence that we do have for the tight coupling of disciplinary formation, historical analysis, and nation-state building in the 19th century moment, in Germany, in Italy, in Greece, in the imperializing Great Britain, in the Iberian Peninsula, in France, really all over, then there are one of two conclusions one might draw. One conclusion that has some appeal now, especially in some continental European circles, but also for different reasons in North American circles, is to agitate more vocally and more concertedly for support to the humanistic disciplines and classics in particular that is embedded within the structures of the nation state, right? And to say, okay, like what we want to do is create a situation where the nation state remains firmly committed to advancing research programs in the humanities and especially in classics. And to that end, there's actual material resources that will flow from the state to these projects, right? This is a vision that continues to animate commitments to the humanities and social sciences in Europe and in Canada, to a significantly less pronounced degree in the United States. So that's one conclusion, right? One can harken back to these enormously transformative disciplinary projects of the 19th and early 20th centuries to invoke Mommsen once again. I'm thinking of something like the international enterprise of collecting inscriptions and editing them that receives support and funding from several different bodies, and say, all right, well, so long as we have national and selectively supranational entities, think of the European Research Council, that can support this work and that advance this work, this is all to the good. It's being funded, it's being supported. This is great. But there's another conclusion. The other conclusion that one could draw on the basis of some of the material that I presented today is that the collusion between scientific research and the nation state needs to be undone, or that it needs seriously to be rethought in ways that create an opening for new forms of collective supportive research that are not beholden to the dictates or the structures of the nation state. This is, again, like somewhat challenging terrain to traverse, right? Because by that logic, one could well say, why don't we kick it back to philanthro-capitalists? Why don't we entrust this all, the scientific research across these many different fields, to billionaire types who might be interested in supporting an excavation here, the collection of antiquities there, and so on. This too is a reversion to an 18th and 19th century paradigm, right? There too, it would be reinventing the wheel, right? But I'm not saying that. I don't think that the end goal should be to create a system of knowledge production that is ultimately dependent on the banking elites of the universe or shipping magnates or whatever. I don't think that's like the laudable end goal here. I think the laudable end goal is to create civic communities that are capable of supporting research at a very high level in the humanities and social sciences. These civic communities may materialize as nation state ones from time to time, but I'm also thinking about the need to support far more local efforts that may not be directly answerable to the imperatives and structures of the nation state itself. And as part of that work, I'm also thinking about what might happen when civic communities organize across nation state lines in order to support different kinds of research. So taking now the cultures of the Mediterranean as a springboard for entertaining this idea, one of the more curious and revealing deficits in the contemporary configuration of the Mediterranean as a space for a civically collective enterprise of research is, of course, the marginalization of North Africa from the study of the interconnectivities of the Mediterranean world. And this marginalization is partly the consequence of the colonial legacies that contribute to the underdevelopment of Africa, to use Walter Rodney's phrase. But it's also reflective of a contemporary moment in which the status of nation states is directly linked to the networks of scholarship that support different enterprises of knowledge production, but that also shut the door on other forms of knowledge production. This takes quite tangible forms. So let's illustrate one right now. What do non-Europeans need in order to enter the European Union in the first place? Well, they need Schengen visas. And I had, in fact, to get a Schengen visa. And it took me forever to even secure an appointment with the Greek consulate, as my hosts know. But let's set aside my specific example here and think more broadly about the architecture of scholarship in classical studies for a moment. This architecture is based firmly in the capacity of a certain group of scholars enjoying a certain form of passport and visa privilege to travel. Travel is what makes this kind of architecture possible. So here's where there is a reflexive expression of the nation state's continuing imprint on the fashioning even of international networks of scholarship. These international networks of scholarship and the kinds of questions that they can raise, the kinds of projects they can undertake, and so on, are ultimately dependent on the forms of accumulated privilege represented by the citizen identities of individual researchers, citizen identities that are attached to the nation states that issue their passports. This is why I think it's important to decouple the work of scientific research from the status and emoluments and prerogatives of the nation state. Not only or not even necessarily because this conjuncture is bound up with a pretty nefarious and insidious legacy, the focus of much of my talk, but because this coupling creates active impediments to the generation of new knowledge. So long as you have a system in place that is organized around the reproduction of this kind of nation-state-centered privilege, you will never have a form of knowledge production in which true mobility of thought is possible. And that seems to me to be a quite bad thing.
Well, thank you so much for everything today. I apologize again for the technical issues we faced. Before we thank you, I would like to ask you, would it be possible for George and I to take a picture of all of us together? We do that with all our guests.
Sure.
We had a series of 22 guests this year, so if it would be fine with you, once we thank you, could we take a photo with you? And having said that, please join me in thanking Danielle for this really engaging talk and the very engaging conversation after the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. I wish I were there.